Hi there, welcome to another episode. We all tend to think of rising prices as the norm, but that's not always the case. Sometimes prices fall, and when they do, the value of the spendable money actually rises. That might sound like great news, right? But is it really? So it's natural to ask, if inflation raises prices, wouldn't negative inflation lower them instead? And isn't that a good news? That condition is called deflation. While it does make goods cheaper, deflation isn't necessarily preferable to inflation. In this video, we'll examine what deflation is, how it operates, and why it occurs, and why it can prove just as damaging to an economy or even worse. Deflation occurs when prices decline and the value of spendable money rises. It is essentially the inverse of inflation. It is also important to distinguish deflation from disinflation. Disinflation refers to a slowdown in the rates of inflation, such as inflation falling from 2% to 1%, where prices are still rising, it's just more slowly. Deflation, by contrast, is negative inflation. For example, 1% negative inflation equates to 1% deflation. Where inflation raises prices and erodes purchasing power, deflation lowers prices and strengthens it. Consider this: if $3 once bought a single burger, after deflation, that same $3 might be able to buy a burger plus a drink. The prices dropped and your money's purchasing power increased. The same amount now buys more. This may sound like a straightforward win for consumers, but the reality is more complicated. To understand why, we need to examine what causes deflation. First of all, moderate deflation can benefit an economy by lowering prices and improve affordability. But just as excessive inflation is harmful, excessive deflation can be even more destructive. The Great Depression of the 1930s, one of the most severe financial crises in history, was driven largely by sustained deflation. So how can falling prices and rising currency value trigger an economic crisis? Consider a shoe factory producing 1,000 pairs daily at $60 each. When deflation hits, demand falls to 800 pairs a day. The owner cut prices to $55 to stimulate sales, but consumer hesitates, expecting further declines. This is a common deflationary psychology, reinforced by pessimistic economic reporting, which drives people to save rather than spend. The factory cut prices again to $50, then $45, then $40, with diminishing returns each time. The factory is able to cut prices like this is because the input cost, like rubber, also falls and initially offsets the pressure, as the supplier faces its own demand slump. But this can't continue indefinitely. The supplier has its own floor, shaped by wages and extraction cost. Once both firms hit that floor and demand still hasn't recovered, the fixed expenses like wages will force layoffs. At this stage, the economy enters a recession, a sustained contraction in the output and GDP over multiple quarters. Workers who keep their jobs may still face wage cuts. If deflation deepens into a self-reinforcing spiral, the supply eventually collapses, and production falls further towards zero, and the factory ultimately goes bankrupt. Displaced workers then search for new employment in an economy where most businesses are simultaneously contracting and shedding staff, leaving few opportunities available. The paradox becomes clear. Prices are low, but incomes and employment have collapsed alongside them, leaving them little purchasing power in the system. This is the core danger of deflation, which is a self-perpetuating cycle where falling prices lead to falling wages, rising unemployment, and shrinking demand. And left unchecked, this can push a recession into a full-blown depression. Given these risks, how can deflation be effectively controlled? And that's the focus of the next section. Since prolonged or excessive deflation damages an economy, so how is it controlled? Both the central bank and the government will intervene, using monetary and fiscal policies to inject money into an economy and reverse deflationary pressure. The central bank relies on monetary policy, meaning decisions around interest rates and the money supply through several key tools. First of such is to lower interest rates, which makes borrowing cheaper, encouraging loans and spending, which helps stimulate recovery. Second, expansionary open market operations allow the central bank to purchase government bonds from commercial banks at favorable prices, which injects liquidity into the system. With more capital available, banks compete by lowering their own lending rates, encouraging borrowing and spending, which increases demand and help businesses resume normal operations. When these measures prove insufficient, the central bank may turn to quantitative easing, which is to create new money to purchase new government bonds and corporate bonds at scale. This encourages both public and private sector spending, which deliberately generates inflation to counteract the deflationary pressure. On the fiscal side, the government policy typically involves two levers. The first is to reduce taxes, which allows households to retain more income for spending, which increases the money supply in the system. Although reducing taxes sound good on paper, it is less commonly used than other measures. The second and the most frequently used measure is to increase government spending on public projects. Infrastructure initiatives such as bridge construction require material, contractors, engineers, and labor at scale. Given the number of government projects nationwide, collectively worth in billions of dollars and employing thousands of workers and businesses, increased public spending injects substantial amounts of money into the economy, which drives demand and helps to offset the deflationary trends. Together, these monetary and fiscal tools form the primary mechanism the government and the central bank use to combat deflation and restore economic stability. Deflation may seem like a welcome relief at first glance, with falling prices and stronger purchasing power. But as we have seen, sustained deflation can trigger a dangerous cycle of falling wages, rising unemployment, and shrinking demand, potentially dragging an economy into recession or even depression. Like inflation, deflation isn't inherently good or bad. What matters is scale and duration. Central banks and government have tools from interest rate cuts to increase public spending to help manage deflation before it spirals out of control. Understanding these dynamics help us to better understand and interpret the economic headlines we see every single day.